Hello friends, welcome to the DotVVM virtual conference. I hope that you have seen the sessions we had prepared for you yesterday, and today we have more nice stuff coming right away in the few next hours. So let me start with the first session about DotVVM for WebForms developers. I understand that it might look a little bit crazy to talk about ASP.NET WebForms in 2020. But I believe that a lot of people will find this session interesting. And it doesn't mean that .vvm would be just a framework for WebForms developers. It's not true. .vvm is a framework for everyone. If you love model view model approach for building web applications, .vvm can work for you really well. But if you are using ASP.NET WebForms, you should also be interested in .vvm because it can make your life easier than anything else probably. So let's dig into how .vvm can help WebForms developers in modernizing their web apps or with just helping them to do their daily tasks easier than with WebForms. So the reason why .vvm still cares about ASP.NET WebForms is that there are a big number of applications that are still using this technology. We all know that these applications are quite old. I have seen a lot of WebForms applications that are older than 15 years. And they are still being used, they are still actively developed, there are still new pages and new features coming into these applications. And of course, these applications need to be maintained. So if there is a new version of a browser, if there is some new requirements, new maybe system updates or new stuff on the web, these applications are trying to make this stuff available to the users. And these applications have been built for a lot of years, so there is a lot of features that may not be used anymore, but they are still in the code base. And of course, because if you work on the same project for such a long time, or maybe there can be a second or third generation of developers on that project, of course, there is some technological debt that is accumulating on this project, and .vvm can offer a way how to get rid of this. So these applications can, of course, be rewritten, and a lot of companies are trying to just rebuild them from scratch. However, even if you find the simplest way how to rewrite this application, this problem doesn't have any easy and quick solution. All the solutions you can possibly find can take months or maybe years, because if something was developed for 15 years, I cannot imagine how it could be completely rewritten in less than half of that time or something like that. Because we have a lot of new features, new languages, new technologies, but I don't think there is a technology that can increase the productivity so much that it could reduce the development time for hundreds of percent. Yeah. So we are maybe productive than we were before, but I'm not sure if we are that more productive. So that's the reason why .vvm cares also about ASP.NET WebForms migration path, because we find it very difficult for people maintaining these applications to continue working on them. And of course, in many cases, the complete rewrite is not possible. Basically, I have seen a lot of projects that chose the way of the full rewrite, and typically it means that you need to either hire a new team or just dedicate some people in the current team just for the new application. And if the old application is still being maintained and developed, it can be quite difficult because not everybody understands what happens, and so you cannot dedicate the people from the team fully to the new application. They will still be asked about how this works, and they will still need to help with the old part. And if you are new people, it means that there is a very difficult knowledge transfer from the old team to the new team. And of course, you will have to implement some features twice because the old application is still being used. And if there is some feature that is really critical, you will have to implement it in the old version. And of course, you will need to have it also in the new version. So there can be also some redundant work. Also, if you try to run those applications in parallel, so you will implement some parts of the applications in the new technologies, but you will need to run this side by side with the old application. It's probable that they will have separate data stores maybe, so it can mean that you would need to synchronize data from one part to the other, and in many cases I have seen that two-way synchronization was needed, and it's of course it's additional work, it's a lot of overhead, there can be conflicts in the data, so it's also not very easy to solve. And on the other hand, I don't want to look like that I'm against all rewrites. There are a lot of cases where rewrite can have also very positive impacts, and for me the crucial thing is that if you need to make a very fundamental changes in the application, and it doesn't matter if it's in the business logic or in the data model or in the user interface, if the application should change dramatically, then the rewrite is probably a better choice. However, if you are basically satisfied with the application and you just need to evolve it and make sure that it will be running for 10 or 15 years, then a rewrite can be very expensive and very effort and can bring a lot of effort. So there is other way of modernizing the application. If you you maintain an old WebForms application, DotVVM allows you to modernize it incrementally. So you can take small pieces of code, do some changes, but the application can still work and it can still be deployed, and you can still fix issues or add new features to the old part, and the new part is starting to grow, and basically all those rewrites can be done in place, so you are still working with the same application. So it's a continuous improvement. You will take page by page or something like that, and you can basically rewrite one page at a time or one feature at a time or something like that. And the most crucial thing for me is that the application can be deployed basically at any time. You can even run the old version of the page with the new version of page side by side, and you can let the users choose if they want to try the new version or if they want to keep with the old version. And you can see this from a lot of services, software as a service applications, that there is, oh, we have a new experimental version, let's try it, and you can basically turn on some feature toggles or something like that. So this is even possible because you are still working in the same application, you have access to the same data, to the same authentication model, and everything else. And because the rewrite is incremental and you can just work by small pieces, it can be handled by the current team. If there is some critical issue, the entire team can focus on fixing that issue. But if there is no critical requirements, all the people in the team can take their pieces of code and try to rewrite them and modernize the application. And of course, if you do this, if you try to modernize your application, you should use this also as an opportunity to introduce more refactoring. So if there is some mess in the code base, you should use this opportunity to clean those things. So if you discover some feature that is not being used, I recommend to remove it or to make the code really clean, because it's natural that the mess is accumulating in old code bases. But if you are doing this change in the project, it's a good thing to do a refactoring together with the modernizing. And I think that this way is great if you don't need to do significant changes in your application. If you just have what you have, if you are satisfied with that or somewhat satisfied with that, and you just need to, or you just want to use more modern tools, you just want to have your life easier and things like that. So for me, the difference between modernizing and rewriting is based on how many changes and or how different the new application should be from the old one. And there is the place for .vvm, because how can .vvm fit into this scenario? Basically, because .vvm supports .NET Framework and .NET Core with the same syntax, with the same principles, with the same view models, it can work as a transition bridge between .NET Framework and .NET Core. Yeah? So there are just two NuGet packages, .vvm.ASP.NET Core and .vvm.owen. And basically, if you exchange the owen package for ASP.NET Core package, all the rest of .vvm can remain the same, and the application should work. There are no other changes in this. Yeah, when we talk about .vvm pages and view models, of course, there can be authentication changes, there can be configuration, dependency injection, and things like that. But from the perspective of .vvm, it's only about changing or exchanging those two NuGet packages. The views and view models will remain as they were. Of course, if you have been using some old API from your view models, for example, if you have been using system web HTTP request, then you need to change this, but it's not a part of .vvm, it's a feature of ASP.NET WebForms. So, of course, all dependencies or references to WebForms must be replaced. But in normal .vvm applications, there is not many scenarios where you actually really need to work with the system web stuff. And most of the changes you will have to do is in the startup CS, because it has been changed from Owen to ASP.NET Core. There is not just one configure method, there are two methods, one for configuring services and one for configuring the request pipeline. And then if you get rid of WebForms dependencies and use .vvm for rendering the pages, then you should be able to do the swap. So if you replace ASPX pages with something else, and it doesn't need to be .vvm, I will be showing how you can do this with .vvm, but if you decide to use any other technology, the principle is the same. If you want to move your old application to .NET Core, you need to get rid of WebForms, because WebForms are not supported on .NET Core. So you need to take all those ASPX pages and replace them with something else. And it can be a bunch of technologies. It can be Angular, it could be React, Blazor is very popular these days. And if I would think about rewrite, I would be looking maybe at Angular, React, or maybe Blazor, because this is the fundamental change. Yeah, all those frameworks are using the client-side logic, so most of the application logic can work on the client side, which means that you will need to make the data on the server accessible to the clients. In this case, in all these three technologies, you would need to build some kind of API, either REST or gRPC or anything like that, but there is you just need to get your data to the client, because all those frameworks are running on the client side. There is a tiny exception of Blazor server, which technically runs on the server side, but I'm not sure how well Blazor server will be used in the production, because it needs a low latency and very reliable network to work really well. Yeah, so this is a tiny little exception, but in general, if you are thinking about the WebAssembly version of Blazor, then you need to get the data somehow to the client side, to the client's browser, which means that you will need to build API. And it doesn't need to be difficult, but in many cases, it's not as easy as that expose the business logic as REST API controllers. Very often you will need to do significant changes in the business logic. If you think about modernizing approach, then .vvm can really help, because you can stay in the same application and you can do the incremental modernization, page by page, class by class, piece by piece, and feature by feature. So with Angular, React, or Blazor, you will need to build and maintain an API. If you already have an API, then this is a little bit easier, but in general the application runs in the browser, so it needs to talk with the database and it should do it through some API. Also, there are performance considerations. If the application is running on the server, and for example, imagine that you need to load, I don't know, customer details page. And on this page, there is a list of orders, there is a customer profile, there is a list, maybe customer address. And these parts of the page may need to do quite a lot of requests to the database. And they can be dependent on each other. So you first need to load the customer details, so you would be able to look for the recent orders. And if you find some recent orders, then you can show some summary information or things like that. So when you get one HTTP request on the server, then the server can do many round trips to the database, and then you are able to render the page. And because typically the server is very close to the database, the latency between the server and database is very small. It can be milliseconds or even less. However, if you just take all your database queries and expose them as REST API operations, for example, then all those queries would get the latency between the client and the server. And it can be much larger. It can be way larger. It can be tens or even hundreds of milliseconds. And then if you will need 10 queries to display the page, you would have to do either asynchronous loading, which complicates more things, or you would need to optimize the communication. So maybe do more queries at once. Yeah, so maybe do a one huge HTTP request, which will get data aggregated for all the parts the page will really need. Maybe a GraphQL can help with this, because this is where this technology is aiming. However, implementing the GraphQL on the server side is also not very easy. So there are a lot of approaches and a lot of complications, and it is typically not one-to-one copy of the current business layer. You will have to think this API through to make sure that it the application would be performant enough. So it's not impossible, but it wouldn't be very easy to do. Also, if you choose the JavaScript framework like Angular and React, it means that you need to learn quite a lot of things, not only the JavaScript language, which isn't so difficult, but also all the ecosystem, because you will probably use Webpack, you will probably use NPM, and all those tools you will need to compile, for example, your TypeScripts to JavaScript, so you may use Rollup, or then there is a lot of libraries, a lot of tools, how to do things, and it's also quite differentiated, so everybody will recommend you their own way of doing things, so it's hard to find one consistent approach for this. Yeah, so it might also include a lot of research and things like that. And of course, if you try to run the new application, which would probably have the .NET Core backend, side by side with the .NET Framework application, because you wouldn't be sitting 6 years in the cellar and rewriting and then boom, deploy everything at once. Probably you will run those applications in parallel. So you will have to deal with different authentication model, maybe different configuration. And if those applications would have separate data stores, you may probably need to synchronize some data. So everything is possible. There are a lot of technical issues, but they are all solvable pretty easily. However, the transition is not really simple. With the modernization scenario of .vvm, it's a little bit easier, because you can access the database directly. You are running in the same application. You can use the same business layer without almost any changes. Maybe there will be some things in the business layer you will need to wrap in order to be used in .vvm, but it's all in the C#, so you have compile time, control, and all those things. And in most cases, you wouldn't even need to do that. It really depends on how your business logic is separated from the UI. If it's well separated, then it will be very easy. If the business logic is in the code behind files, then you should expect some refactoring to be done. But still, it will probably be easier than refactoring this into a REST API and then consuming that API and working with that on the client side. So this should be also a little bit easier. And if your business logic is well separated from the UI, it will be trivial. The biggest thing for me is that the business logic really doesn't need a lot of refactoring. We will see this in a few minutes in the demo, and you just keep it as is, which means that it's not such a risky thing to start to use this method, because there is not a big chance that you would need to touch the business logic, and therefore you probably won't create many breaking changes. Of course, there can be some breaking changes that will happen, but it shouldn't be very severe. There should be quite a small number of them. And also, what can also be interesting, all the WebForms application, I have seen they were using some ancient authentication models like Forms authentication or Windows authentication. And because you are just adding new features, new framework, but in the same application, it will just integrate with what you already have. So if you need to change the authentication model, which especially in the enterprise environment can take just 1 year to communicate and to design how the new authentication should work. So you don't need to wait until this is resolved and designed and approved. You just can add new pages into this application without changing the authentication model. And then after you are ready to change the authentication model to some more modern version, you can do this after you are completely ready for that. So yes, this is also a little bit easier than if you plan to do a full rewrite. So I have tried to create some helpful animation of how the migration process with .vvm can work. And again, please don't expect that it's some wizard where you can click next, finish, and boom, you have your WebForms application ported to .NET Core. You need to replace WebForms with something else, which means rewriting a significant part of the application. You need to rewrite all the ASPX pages and code behind files which are dependent on WebForms. So you need to get rid of one quite big framework in the application and change it for another. So we can be talking about weeks or maybe months or maybe a small number of years if the application is really huge. I have seen WebForms applications with thousands of ASPX pages. So then in that case, you should expect that the migration will take, for example, 2 or 3 years or something like that. Again, it really depends on how complicated those pages are. But if the application is reasonably small, then you can do this change really quickly. And for a lot of applications I have ever seen, in most cases, I think that it should be possible to rewrite them in months. Yeah, so maybe in less than 1 year. It really depends on how well the business logic is separated and how much refactoring will be needed during the process. So in the initial state, you will have your application which will just use .NET Framework. So probably I hope that it's at least .NET Framework 4.5.1, which is the lowest version that is supported by .vvm. If you are on an older version, you need to upgrade to .NET 4.5.1 at least. And then in the application process, there is the WebForms pipeline, which is responsible for handling all the requests. So if you get an HTTP request, it can go through typically the forms authentication. It can be, of course, anything else, but this is the most common scenario. And it's routed to some ASPX page, which probably is using some master page, because all the ASP.NET Web Forms application are probably using master pages, and the request is dispatched. Yeah? And if you get a request that points to another page, again, the Web Forms pipeline will take care of it, and it will route it to the specific page and do everything that needs to be done. The next step in this, so this is the initial state. This is how it looks at the beginning. And if you want to start with the .vvm modernization process, you need to add two NuGet packages. First is .vvm.owin, which is the owin version of .vvm. And then there is a Microsoft owin host system web. You may have this package in your application already, because some frameworks need it. If you are, for example, using Web API or SignalR, there is a chance that you will already have owin host system web installed in your project. If it's not there, you need to add it. And what it does is that it will add a second pipeline to the application. So the WebForms pipeline will be here, and it will be wrapped with the owin request pipeline. It's hard to say if they are side by side, or if the owin is wrapping the WebForms, or if WebForms is wrapping the owin pipeline, because in reality they can touch the request in various phases in the IIS pipeline, but they are both integrated with the IIS pipeline. And when you get the HTTP request, then it first gets to the owin pipeline that can handle it by itself. And if it cannot handle it, it will just move it, or it will just delegate it to the WebForms pipeline, which can do what it has been doing for all the time before. Yeah, so when we now get an HTTP request and it goes to an ASPX page, we haven't been rewriting anything by that time. Yes, everything is still in WebForms. Then the owin will just pass the request to the ASP.NET WebForms pipeline, which will handle it as usual. So there is no change in this really. Yeah, but the pipeline is there and it's ready for us to plug the new version in. So now we want to start with the modernization process. So we can pick some ASPX page. So I have marked this one, and I have moved it a little bit in the background, because we can still keep it in the project. If anything breaks, we can just fix this quickly by just reverting back to the previous version that was working. So I recommend to keep these pages for some time. If you really find some issues, you can quickly redeploy new version with the old version of the page. And the first thing we will need to do is to create a copy of the master page and rewrite it in .vvm. So this is the first thing we should start rewriting. It's the master page. Or of course, if the application has more master pages, we should rewrite all of them, because this is typically the thing that is used everywhere. So we should start with this. And you will see in the demo that the rewrite of the master page is not very complicated typically. So we will see how it can be done. And then when we have the master page, we can start rewriting the ASPX page into .vvm syntax, which means the extension will be .html. Yeah? And mostly it's a copy paste. And then you will need to change WebForms controls with some .vvm controls. There are some controls that are very similar, for example, repeater and also the grid view. There are some controls which do not have .vvm equivalents yet. The biggest issue for me are the login controls, because if you have been using the ASP login, ASP forgotten password wizard, there are no equivalent controls in .vvm. You need to create the forms by yourself, but maybe you can leave these pages and migrate them at the very end, because there is a chance that you would be exchanging forms authentication with some other authentication model that will maybe not need these pages at all. Because if you, for example, switch to, I don't know, social login providers, or for example Azure Active Directory, then you won't need your login form, you won't need your forgotten password process, because it's handled by the external identity provider. So I recommend to keep the authentication pages as they are, and rewrite them at the very end of the migration process, because unless you are really sure that you want to switch the authentication model now. Yeah, so I would start with something simpler, which doesn't need to work with authentication much, and you just take one page at a time and you can rewrite it in DotHTML syntax. And once you register a .vvm route in the OWIN request pipeline, then this happens. So when you get a request that points to an old version of the application, some old page that haven't been migrated yet, so it will be passed to the WebForms pipeline and dispatched like usual. So there are no changes in this. And if you push a request for a new page, then the OWIN pipeline will handle it by itself, and it won't pass it to the WebForms pipeline. So the old page wouldn't be used, and a new page will be used to handle the request. Yeah, and this is running in the same application with the same authentication model. You will see that the authentication integrates with what is been using in WebForms, and you will see that it will just work side by side in the same application. So this is how you can start the migration. You can pick one page, maybe one page that is not critical at all, create a master page in .vvm, and of course you will use the same CSS, so the master page will look exactly the same. The users shouldn't be able to see the difference. And then you can just take the ASPX page and rewrite it and start using it instead of the old version. And if you keep the old version there, you still are able to do a quick revert. So if you find that something is not working there, you can just remove one routing rule, so the OWIN wouldn't try to handle this page, and just pass the request to the WebForms pipeline, which will work as it was working before. Yeah, so this is how it can work, and there is also a safe plan B if anything goes wrong. Okay, so then the migration in progress, and this phase can take quite a long time, because probably there can be hundreds of those pages. So you will be picking pages, maybe one at a time, or you can port this group by group, for example. It depends on the capacities, it depends on the current situation, current requirements from the users. Yeah, it depends. Also, you can add new pages in this process, because the users will probably require new features to be delivered. Yeah, so I will be picking some pages for migrations, and I will try to rewrite them, and once I'm ready, I will register a routing rule for them, so they will be handled by .vvm. So this is the request to the first old page that hasn't been migrated. So again, it will go through the WebForms pipeline, and if it's a new request to some OWIN, some new already rewritten page, it will go through the OWIN pipeline and be dispatched like this. And now we are almost there. So again, I will be picking the last page for migration and replace it with the .html version, and then all the requests should go through the OWIN pipeline through .vvm, and the WebForms pipeline will be only used for the authentication or may be avoided completely. And once you get rid of all dependencies on the WebForms, then you will be able to switch to .NET Core. So we can remove the master page, we can remove the old pages, and now the entire application is using .vvm. And now we should think about going to .NET Core. So we can uninstall the OWIN packages, we can uninstall .vvm.owin, and now you can either change your CSproj, so it will use the new short brief syntax, and it will use .NET Core, or you can just create a project next to the original one in .NET Core and just copy all the .vvm pages and copy all the code that's involved. It doesn't matter. But this new project will use .vvm.ASP.NET Core package. But the syntax of these files and the view models, there are no changes in this. Really, nothing will change here. And you just need to remove the WebForms So the OWIN and ASP.NET WebForms request pipeline will be away, and it will be replaced with ASP.NET Core request pipeline. This step involves rewrite of the startup CS file. So there is the configuration of the pipeline for OWIN, so you will need to convert it to ASP.NET Core pipeline and things like that. Maybe there will be some other changes because there is different logging mechanisms on ASP.NET Core. There are also some differences in the caching, and there are differences, for example, in the dependency injection. Maybe you have been using some IOCDI container like Unity or Castle Windsor on the .NET framework. Now with .NET Core, you can still use these containers, or you can replace them with the dependency injection, which is part of the .NET Core, the Microsoft Extensions dependency injection package. It's up to you. There can be more changes at a time at this step, and all the changes are global. They are affecting the entire application, so you should then test the entire application thoroughly. But it's doable. And finally, the forms authentication, of course, is also not supported in the ASP.NET Core, so you will need to replace it with some ASP.NET Core authentication. And this can mean that it won't be using cookies anymore. Maybe you will use some JWT tokens or Azure Active Directory or something like that, so it doesn't need to be authentication tickets in the cookies. But if you are still happy with your own login forms and reset password processes, and maybe you are using ASP.NET Identity to persist the user accounts, then you will probably use the ASP.NET Core cookies authentication, which will also work. Yeah, so this is how the process looks like. And now when you switch the project to .NET Core, you are finished. The migration is over. Of course, it's not such quick like my 10 minutes talking. It will take weeks or months, hopefully not years, but still most of the business logic can remain as is, because we have been only rewriting ASPX pages and their code behind files into DOT HTML pages and their view models. Yeah. If these code behinds have been calling any services in the application, if they have been, for example, using Entity Framework, that can stay as it was. Yeah, so you don't need to rewrite that. You don't need to even introduce new APIs and or change significantly the queries that are being sent to the database. Yeah, so now all the requests are routed through this pipeline and handled by this, and everything is handled by .VVM. So now you are running on .NET Core. There are a few things to consider. Of course, as I mentioned several times, you need to rewrite the front-end files, which means ASPX, ASCX, so the user controls, and master pages. If you are also using the app themes or other WebForms features, like the mobile versions of the controls or mobile pages and things like that, these will also need to be redone because they are also concerning WebForms. Also, all the references to the system.web.something will need to be changed because system web is not ported to .NET Core, and it never will be. Yeah, so this is the thing. And also their code behinds for these pages should be refactored in the view models, and that's what you will see in the demo I will be showing in a few minutes. And if you have been using data source controls in the ASPX pages, like the SQL data source or things like that, or if you have been using business logic in your code behind files, then some refactoring will be needed. So that's an issue, and it can make these tasks more difficult. But if your business logic is separated, then it will be easier. So take this as an opportunity not just to move all the garbage from the code behind to your view models, which is of course possible, but I would very try to discourage you from doing this. Otherwise, instead, you should just refactor these things out to some services or to some other project, maybe some class library or something like that, and really decide what is the logic that is connected to the presentation of the data, and what is the business rules, what is the business logic, what is the real functionality that can be decoupled from the user interface. Yeah, so you will see how we can deal with this. And there can be some other things that can prevent you from the migration to .NET Core. If you are using Entity Framework, you need to upgrade it to Entity Framework 6.3, which is supported starting .NET Core 3.0. If you think about rewriting or changing Entity Framework with Entity Framework Core, it is of course possible, but it can be also quite difficult, because EF Core was rewritten from scratch basically, and it is somewhat similar, but the internal implementation is very different. So the things that were fast in EF6 can be very slow in EF Core, and vice versa. There's a lot of improvements in EF Core, but still the complexity of queries that could be translated by EF6 is much bigger than what you can afford with EF Core. So in EF Core, if you want to switch EF to EF Core, there is a very high chance that you would need to rewrite many queries, because EF6 could translate almost everything to the database. However, EF Core is not so good in that. It aims to maybe different use cases or to different paradigms on top of which the database applications are written right now. It's more than 10 years younger than the classic EF, so there is also a fundamental difference of how the queries are dispatched and evaluated. So maybe you can stay with Entity Framework if you upgrade to 6.3, because this is supported on .NET Core, and it will work as it was. If you have been using WCF services, then you should find some way either to rewrite them or to replace them with something else. There is actually an GitHub repo with the WCF source codes, so you can try this open source version that was released under .NET Foundation, but I haven't tested it, so I don't know how many differences there are, and if it's just that you can just install some NuGet packages in the project and the WCF services would magically start working. I think that there's at least one difference. You would have to move the configuration from webconfig to the C# code, because there is basically no webconfig in ASP.NET Core. So the configuration should be done from the C# code. And there can be a lot of other differences, because a lot of things in WCF were relying on machine keys, for example, and they are also solved completely differently in .NET Core. So I haven't tried this. If you try to do this, let us know how it worked, because I'm really interested in seeing the experience of other people doing this. We have chosen the way to rewrite the WCF services to something else, because we were using REST endpoints anyway inside WCF, so we have rewritten them to Web API, which is also using REST. And in the migration process, don't be afraid of doing larger refactorings. Of course, you need to test if you haven't break anything, but if you see some parts that are not being used anymore, don't be afraid of removing them. If you need something from it, you will be able to find it in your Git repo in the history, but don't pollute your code base with unnecessary code, because it makes the maintenance much more difficult. Yeah, so don't be afraid of doing larger changes in the code, because they can look difficult at the beginning, but over time you will be very happy that you have done them. Yeah, so that's a recommendation from my experience, because we have been moving several projects using this way to .NET Core, and this is what our experience was in the past. Okay, so complete migration scenario means it's described in our sample repo. We have a version for C#. We have also version for VB.NET. So if you are using ASP.NET WebForms with Visual Basic, there is a repo which shows how to do it. Unfortunately, .vvm doesn't work well with VB. So if this process means that the pages and the view models will be rewritten to C#. However, the business logic can stay in VB because it will be referenced from the C# project. So your view models will be in C#, but you can call your VB functions and VB classes from the view models. So only the UI will use C# as a language, but if your business logic is in VB.NET, you can still use this scenario. I have this repo opened here, so this is the C# version. There is a link for the VB version here in this node. So if you are interested in this VB version, click here. And there are several branches in this repo. So there is the first stage, initial state, where the application is only in WebForms. There is the step where I have installed .vvm. Then there is a showcase how the migration in progress looks like. So some pages are already in .vvm, some are still in the WebForms. Here is how it looks when the migration is completed, but we are still in the .NET framework. And the last branch shows the new project that is ported to .NET Core. So if you clone the repo, you can browse these branches and see what has changed between them. So you will get the idea of the individual steps. And it's also described here in the README, so there are exact instructions how you should work. So basically you install .vvm OWIN and Microsoft OWIN host system web package. You can use this startup, this .vvm startup, and you need to add some GUID in this project. I will show it in the demo. And we have also a page with a cheat sheet of differences between .vvm and WebForms. So you can read through this. There are examples how it works and how the syntax looks like in WebForms and how it looks like in .vvm. So we are just here. There are not all differences, but the main fundamental differences, if you are a WebForms developer, I recommend to read this first because you will get the idea of what's different in WebForms and in .vvm. Yeah. And there is also a recording of a session from .NET Conf where I have described this process. So if you don't want to browse these branches, you can just see the video, which is linked here in the README. Okay. And we have created one other thing. So the .vvm syntax is different from ASPX. We are also using server controls, but we have different syntax for data binding, and the controls aren't exactly the same. Sometimes the name and property names are similar or same, but the rest is different. So it's not just that you will replace ASP prefix to DOT and it would work. There are more transforms. However, we have created a simple tool that can do the basic transforms for you. It's called ASPX converter, and it's available on .vvm.com/webforms/convert, and it can do simple transforms. So do not expect it to be 100% complete migration tool. It's nothing like that, but it can help you with the mundane and boring transforms that are easy to do. And of course we will be adding more and more transforms and rules to this tool, so I hope that we will be able to simplify the migration process from from ASP.NET WebForms syntax to .vvm syntax. So let's look at the demo of how it works. First, I will run this application. It's a simple WebForms application. It's just one page, and it's not a real WebForms application. I have written it a few weeks ago, but I have tried to compose it in a way that you would see all the differences between the .vvm markup and the ASPX markup. Of course, migrating a real application would be more difficult, and I'm not trying to pretend that migration process to .vvm is that easy, but for the demo purposes, I didn't want to take some real-world large application because it would scare everyone to death even before we even open the solution. So that's why I create an artificial WebForms page that we would be migrating. Okay, so there is a simple login page. It's using the ASP login control. So this is one thing that it's not supported in .vvm. In .vvm, you would need to create your own login form, but maybe you wouldn't even need it if you decide to change the authentication model together with the migration. Okay, so now I'm logging in the application, and it's a quite easy page where I can add a task. So new task. I can select some categories and click add task, and it will add a row into list with some text. So basically I'm using a repeater for rendering this list, and also there are nested repeaters because those tags are being rendered also with a repeater control. So it's not a very difficult page. However, you will see that I will be able to migrate it to .vvm in a few minutes. Okay, let's look how it looks, how the markup looks like. So this is my master page. So you can see I'm including Bootstrap, I'm including some JavaScripts, and my custom CSS for the badges to have the different colors. And this is the classic ASP.NET syntax. So there is the form runner server and things like that. I'm using Bootstrap navigation. So this is this crazy long hierarchy of nav and div and span elements with those CSS classes. That's why I really like Bootstrap for .vvm controls, because this is just BS responsive navigation, and I will just add buttons inside and it will render all this clutter for me. However, now we are in WebForms, so we are doing this the classic way. And this is the responsive navigation toggle. It's not interesting. This is the title. And here in the menu, I have a login view. So this is the drop-down menu with the logout button. I'm using the login view control, and in the logged in template, I have this drop-down menu. I'm using login name control to print out the current username. I'm using the login status, so I can do this logout button, which is done in WebForms using logout status button. Yeah? And then there is just the content placeholder, so the contents of default ASPX will go here. So let's look to default ASPX. I have the panel, and I'm using the panel because I want, when I add new task and when I'm in the text box and press enter, I want it to submit the form. And because everything in WebForms is one huge form, so I'm using ASP panel to specify my default button. Yeah, so when I press enter in this text box, this button will be pressed. That's the feature of WebForms and this default button property. And for categories, I'm using checkbox list. So I'm giving it a collection of categories and it will render all these checkboxes. Unfortunately, it's rendering them in a table, so it's hard to make it really responsive. And you would need to build your own repeater with checkboxes if you want to use, for example, Bootstrap columns or something like that. Yeah, because this is a table, so if the page is not very wide, this wouldn't wrap to multiple lines. Yeah, unfortunately. Okay, so let's continue. There is the add task button, and here we have the repeater with the tasks. And because I'm using the nested repeater and there is no way to data bind inside it, I need to override the onItem data bound event. And in this event, I need to set the data source to my inner repeater. So basically what I'm doing in the data bound, if it's not a header and footer, if it's item or alternating item, I'm looking for the tasks categories repeater, which is the inner repeater. And I'm just filling it, setting data source and calling data bind. Yeah, so this is how I can work with nested repeaters in WebForms. It's not very easy to do. There is some typecasts and it's easy to make mistake here. And it's not very good, but still we have been used for it. Also, this is what also have been driving me nuts in WebForms. There is the header template, which contains just the opening tag, and there is the footer template, which contains just the closing tag, and we don't have such crazy things in .vvm. Yeah, so this is what will need to be refactored, for example. Okay, so this is how it works. In the code behind, there is also some logic that calls my task service, which is doing all the entity framework magic. So right now in this application, I have already refactored my business logic to a separate class, task service. So it's not here in the code behind, but of course I can imagine that a lot of applications unfortunately are opening their DB context here and just working with the database right here in the code behind files, which I would not recommend. So if before you start migrating, you should just refactor this logic out. You don't need to use the dependency injection in WebForms if you don't have this set up. Just create instance of the service, and later when we rewrite this into .vvm, we can start using dependency injection. But move this at least to different classes, because otherwise it's a mess. You don't want to move just to the view models. Okay, so that's it. And let's start migrating. I have already finished few steps. So I have installed .vvm.owin package and also the Microsoft Owin host system web packages. If you look in the packages config, these packages have a lot of dependencies. So I have installed .vvm.owin and I have installed Microsoft Owin host system web. The other packages are mostly the dependencies of these two packages. .vvm is using .NET Standard, so if you can upgrade your project to latest .NET Framework, the number of NuGet packages will be significantly less, because the new .NET Framework versions support .NET Standard without adding any additional packages, or these are just meta packages which do not add any real references. However, I have just installed these two packages. Then I have added Owin startup class, which you can do like this. There is in the add new item, there is an item called Owin startup class, so you can add it to the project. And I have moved all the .vvm related stuff into this v2 folder, so it would be separated from the rest of the application. It's up to you. I just wanted to show that it doesn't need to be in the root of the website. It can be anywhere in your structure. So for example, if your application has more sections and you first want to try .vvm on some, I don't know, admin section or something like that, which is not exposed to a lot of users, you can of course use .vvm in just one subfolder in your project. It doesn't need to be here in the root. So for making clear what's .vvm related and what's not, I have created the v2 folder. So I have added the Owin startup class, and it has to be marked with this attribute so Owin could find it. There can be only one class marked like this. And in the configuration method, I am adding .vvm middleware. So I am calling appuse.vvm, and I need to pass some parameters to it. The first is application physical path. So I'm taking this from the hosting environment. And this is system web stuff. So once I move this to .NET Core, I will need to change this parameter to a .NET Core version of this, because this is only part of .NET Framework, but this is just one property, so it's not easy. But if you are using hosting environment in your code, that's one of the things that will need to be replaced. So prepare, maybe add this path to some constant or to some static class, or maybe hide it behind some interface, so you would be able to change the implementation later. Then the second parameter is if it's development environment, because .vvm will display more detailed error pages if you are running in the development environment, so you can do this. So this is how I register .vvm in the pipeline, and in the .vvm startup, I'm just, these are just empty methods. I'm not configuring anything. This line is commented out. And in the configure services, I'm just registering default upload download service of .vvm to some temporary directory. And I'm registering my business logic into the iService collection, which is the default IOCDI solution of .NET Core. And also because this library is .NET standard, so .vvm will be able to use it even if you are running in .NET Framework. So I have started using dependency injection, Microsoft Extensions dependency injection, that I will be using on .NET Core, and I'm using it right now with .NET Framework. So I will be prepared for that, and I wouldn't need to introduce the dependency injection later in the view models. I will have it there ready from the first moment. And right now I don't have any .vvm pages in the application and nothing configured in the route table, but it works. Yeah, so you have seen that this application still works. So there are really no changes in that. Yeah, so I can log out and I'm redirected back to the login page, and I can sign in again and I'm back here. So everything is right now in the WebForms, but we can now start rewriting it. Okay? So first thing we need to migrate is the master page, because all the pages live in the master page, so the first .vvm page will need it. So let's create a master page here. So in the views directory here, I will create a new item and look for .vvm section here, and I'm adding a new master page. So I will use the same names, so it's clear what is a rewrite of what. So I will keep the name. So in WebForms it's site.master. In .vvm it will be site, and the extension is .master. Okay, I will want to have my view model for the master page created. So that's it. And this is my master page. And you can see that it's quite similar. There is just no form run at server because .vvm doesn't need the entire page to be one huge form. And instead of ASP content placeholder, we have .dot content placeholder. Okay, so this is the master page. And let's just copy paste this markup from WebForms. And now I will open the WebForms converter. So I will go to .vvm.com/webforms/convert, or you can just click on this button, ASPX converter. And unfortunately, the bigger screen you have, the better, because we didn't have time to make some full screen mode of this. But so this text area is quite small, but if you have a larger screen, you will be more happy with this. And of course, we will be improving this application, so you can expect it to be better. Okay, so I have pasted my master page code here and click continue. And this tool will analyze all those things that it can, and it will offer me some suggestions. So for example, in .vvm, we do not need the run at server attribute. So you can expand this section, and there will be all the occurrences of run at server. If you click on show, it will mark this in the markup. Yeah, so you will see that this is here. And if you click on apply fix, we will just change the markup for you, so you can easily remove the run at server. Okay, so now we are here, and I can say, okay, I trust the .vvm people, so let's apply all the fixes. So now it should remove all the run at server I had in my code. Yeah. Then there are two content placeholders in the page. So if you click, you can see there is one content placeholder and there is a second, yeah, in the page. So I can also let them change to DOT content placeholder. Okay, so I'm all set, which doesn't mean that this page will work right away in .vvm, but it means that this tool doesn't know any other rules that it could suggest to me. So let's just copy the code and let's paste it here to .vvm master page. Okay. And now this first directive, it's not being used, it's not needed, so I can safely remove it. And now you should go through the code and review everything if it's okay. Yeah. So this is just plain HTML. This content placeholder is here. In .vvm you need to have ID on it, so this is correct. The script, there is no changes in that. In .vvm we don't need the form element to wrap the entire page, so goodbye my form. Let's remove it. And this is just bootstrap stuff, this is just bootstrap stuff. And if you have the commercial version of the .vvm extension, it's really helpful because it can display these squiggles if it finds some problems. It doesn't discover everything, but it can discover quite a lot of things. And it seems that there is no login view control in .vvm. So we need to find an alternative. And the alternative for this is DOT authenticated view. And the tool could translate login view into authenticated view because the structure is similar, but we didn't introduce this feature yet. But we have non-authenticated template and we have authenticated template. So the first template will be displayed to the users who are not signed in. So let's move this content right here. And then let's move this content right here. Okay, so this is one transform, and I'm sure that the tool will support this soon because this transform is pretty easy. Okay, so what we have next? So this should be fine. This is a little issue because we don't want to have hard-coded links in the application, but it's not a big issue right now because this page is not ported to .vvm. However, if this link leads to a page that has been ported, I really suggest to replace it with DOT route link control and use routes to generate your URLs. It will make all the things easier. Okay, but now let's continue. For now, we can live with this. And here, this is just bootstrap stuff, and there is the login name control. We also do not have login name control, but what you can do is to look up in your context and look at the current user identity and print out the name. And because we don't have this username in the view model, we can do two things. We can add a username property in the view model and display it using value binding. But since there is no way how the user can change the username except of logging in as somebody else, which would reload the page probably, we can use a trick. We can use a resource binding, and we can print out context.http context.user identity name. And because it's a resource binding, it will be evaluated on the server. So in the result HTML, just the name of the user will be printed out, and there would be no knockout.js data bind generated. So we can replace login name with this, and it should work. And there is the login status control, which can generate logout button. In .vvm, we don't have anything like login status control, so you need to create your own button. And it's a link, so we will use link button. Text will be sign out, and the click handler, we will call some sign out function, which I don't have right now, but it doesn't matter. I will let it generate it. But before I do that, I will also disable validation on this button, because if you are on some form, you didn't fill all the values, and you want to sign out, we shouldn't be asking you to first fill out the form before you can sign out. You can just sign out. So I will remove the validation on this button. Okay, so we can delete the login status, and I can generate the sign out method in my master page view model, which is a good thing because all the pages which are using master page will need this method. And because in .vvm, if your page is using some master page, the view models should also derive. Yeah, so the view model of the specific page should derive from the view model of the master page. So it will have the sign out method because it's declared in the base class. Yeah. So right now we are using the forms authentication in the WebForms app. So if you open the web config, you will see we are using authentication mode forms. And so it's forms authentication. And I have, for the default ASPX page, I have allowed only signed in users. Yeah, so there is deny and question mark. Okay. So I can say forms authentication sign out, which will remove the authentication cookie, and then I should just redirect to the default page. So I can say contacts.redirect to local URL, and we will just redirect to root of the application, so the user will get to the home page. Okay, so forms authentication sign out, and this line will need to be changed when you change your authentication model, but it's just in one place. And of course you can abstract this, you can move it to some, I don't know, authentication logic class, so you will have all the authentication stuff on one place, so it will be easier to rewrite. Okay, so this is how it works. And now we need to port, so the master page should be ready by now, because there is just sorry, that's not it, this is it. So there is, the rest is fine, we don't have any run it servers here, so it should work, and no squiggles. So let's see. And now I can port the default page. This is the only page in my application, so once I do it, I will have basically the migration finished. But let's do it. So I will add a new item, just .vvm page. I will name it also default. And so let's try it. And I need to embed it in master page, so I will choose my master page. So this default page would come into my master page. Okay, so let's do it. And we have the head content placeholder, which we won't probably need, but there is the main content placeholder. And again, I can use my converter tool. So I can just take all the markup and paste it in my converter tool and click on continue. And again, I can see some suggestions. So there is the ASP content, which can be changed to DOT content. So you can review those fixes and let this tool to fix them. Then there are run it servers. So we have made sure that it works in the previous page. So I can say, okay, I trust. Let's remove run it server everywhere. And then we have some more sophisticated transforms right here. So for example, there is a text box control. Oh, the scrolling doesn't look like it's working. Okay, but this is the control. And .vvm knows that in .vvm we have DOT text box. And if you are using text box, you will probably want a string property in your view model. So this task will do two things. It will change the text box to DOT text box, and also it will generate a data binding to a new task name property. And if you go to step 3, and you can always return back, there is a piece of code you can paste to your view model. So you have the string property generated right here. Yeah, so you can just copy and paste it to the view model. Of course, this is not perfect. You may want to change it, but if you are using text box, there is a very high chance that you will need this property right now. Okay, so this is the text box. Now we have the button. So if I click on show, the scrolling doesn't work every time, so we will fix this. And we can also change the button. And again, if you work with buttons, there is a high chance that you will need a click method. So it will generate a click method for you, and you just paste the code in it. Okay, so let's move next. There is a repeater, but before I click on the repeater, there is the header template and the footer template. Right now, the tool doesn't suggest these recommendations in a correct order. We will be fixing this, but first I will use this move header template before the control. In .vvm, we don't like these unclosed elements. They are causing us a lot of problems. So basically, if you want to do this, you should enclose your repeater inside this div. So this task will move the contents of header template before the repeater. So apply fix, and you can see that this is before the repeater. There are some issues in the reformatting, but it can be fixed once you paste this code in Visual Studio and press the format keyboard shortcut. The same thing applies to the footer template, so we can move what's in the footer template after the repeater. So let's do this, and you can see now the repeater is in the div, and now we can change the repeater. So let's change repeater to ASP, so from ASP repeater to DOT repeater, and you can see that we have two repeaters. So this is the first, this is the second. So let's say apply, and we are done. Of course, there could be more suggestions that the tool might get in the future. For example, you can see these binding expressions the tool right now cannot replace, but we will be working on this. So I hope that we will succeed in bringing more rules into this. If you want to help us, it's possible, because if you go to this repo, you will see this ASPX converter project right here, and this project contains some rules. So there is the matching folder, and here are the matchers. So you can see how these rules are implemented. So you can, if you look in the button matcher, for example, so you can see that this rule is matching ASP button and ASP link button elements, and it generates some suggestions which can do the fixes, and these fixes can change the source code. They can generate something in the view model. So if you are interested in using this tool, and if you try it on a few pages and find a rule that could be implemented to help, then we will be happy to talk with you. And if you will be able to write this control matcher or attribute matcher, it would be the best thing in the world, because you can just send us a pull request and we can just approve it and deploy it to this tool. So if you start using this tool and if you miss any features in the tool, let us know. We will be happy to accept the suggestions. And if you are not afraid of using GitHub, feel free to send us pull requests. We will be very happy. More rules we will be able to include in the tool, the better, because the tool will be more helpful thanks to it. Okay, so now I'm finished, so I can copy the code and paste it in my default.html file, and I will need to also go through all these things. So the first thing which can make problems is this panel, because there is no panel control in .vvm. But the only purpose of this panel is that we wanted to mark some button as a default button in the panel. So if you press enter, then the button will be clicked. And we can use the form element in HTML, which has the similar behavior. If you press enter in the form, then the first submit button in the form will be triggered. Yeah, so I can do this. Also, the CSS class is used in ASP controls, but we need to change it to class because we don't have any CSS class. And we can get rid of this default button because it's not needed. Okay, so right now then we are having the text box, which is fine. There is just a squiggle because I haven't created the view model yet, but I'm going to. Then there is a problem because the checkbox list control doesn't exist in .vvm. We will have to replace it with the repeater with checkboxes. But the good news is that thanks to it, you can make this responsive, because you can render these checkboxes not in the table, but just in one line, and they will wrap if the screen is narrow. Okay, so I will do this later, but let's continue. There is a button, so ID text, it's fine. There is a class that should be this, and sorry, I have forgot to change CSS class in this text box right now, so that's it. We don't need the onClick attribute, and the tool should remove this because it generated this click. But again, this is more the rule ordering problem, because we have the rule for removing the onClick. But if we first rename ASP button to .dot button, then this rule is not applicable anymore. So this is the problem. But here in the click, I'm calling on add task click. I may want to rename this method, but not now. It's not so important. And this here, I have a squiggle for the repeater because it's missing the data source collection. Yeah, so it's missing the required property, and I won't need on item data bound. So let's say data source equals, and I will for sure need some collection of tasks in my view model. So that's for now. And then we don't support transforming these expressions right now, but I think that we can do support for this. So let's just change this to the task name. And we are printing it out, so we need 2 curly braces. Then there was a data binding which was composing the CSS class. I need to also change it to a value binding. And we can use expressions here, so I will use this string, and instead of eval category color, I will just use category color because we are strongly typed. And now I can close the attribute, and that's it. And I need to print out category name, so let's do this. Okay, so now I'm almost ready. Item template, DOT repeater, everything is working. So now I have ported practically all the things in the markup except for this checkbox list. So let's do the checkbox list. Basically, I will have some collection categories, sorry, not data context, data source. So I will need some categories collection in my view model, and inside the repeater, I can add item template for more clarity. Inside, I will have DOT checkbox. Text of the checkbox will be the name of the category, so category name. And if somebody selects the checkbox, then this value will be used. So the ID property will be used as a value of the checkbox. And there is the checked items property, which points to a collection of the selected IDs. Yeah, so instead of this is a different approach than it was in WebForms, because then in WebForms checkbox had a collection of checkbox list had a collection of items, and you had to use where and filter out those that are selected. If you look in the code behind, there is this crazy expression, and it was an old collection which wasn't strongly typed, so I needed to use off type list item. Then I need to filter out those which are selected, and the values were strings, so I needed to parse them to integers. So to get category IDs, this was quite a long expression in WebForms. In .vvm, we will just bind the checkboxes to the same collection, and it will be just a list of strings. The only thing you need to remember is that I need to go one scope up, because right now I'm in the repeater, and this collection of selected values is not in the category entries, it's in my main view model. So I can say selected IDs. New task category IDs. Yeah, so to keep this naming convention at least similar. Yeah, so I will be binding the results, the checked IDs, to a collection which will be basically a list of integers. Yeah, so this is how to replace checkbox list. So I can remove it right now. And now the only thing we need to do is to finalize the view model. So let's go back to the converter. I can grab at least this piece of code. It's not much, but still better than nothing. And let's paste this into our default view model. So I have a new task name. And if I return here in the default view model and press some keys, you can see then this squiggles just disappeared. So let's do this. Let's create categories. And it's not a collection, it's not an object because it doesn't know the data type. It will be list of category model. So let's import my using on the top. So this is the global list of categories. And let's figure out the logic later. Then there should be category name and ID, which is now correct because I have kept the names and I know that I'm using the category model class, which is defined in my business layer. Let's put it this way. And now I can generate new task category IDs, and hopefully it will generate the property for me. So yes, you can see it generated this thing. It doesn't know the type of IEnumerable, but I can change it to list of int. And .vvm doesn't like empty lists, so let's just initialize it to make sure that the value is there. Okay, so these two properties are for my new task. So this should be easy. And now the last squiggles are here. So I need to define the tasks in my view model. So let's do it. And again, it will be, sorry, this is some issue. The file was reverted back. So let's go back and let's write this manually. I don't know why it happens. Sometimes it just happens that the file is reverted to some previous state. It can be some bug in our extension. And this is a list of tasks. And because I'm using the task model and the data bindings, even in the previous version, were bound to the task model, then it works. This repeater, it needs the data source. So I'm just filling the data source and it should be categories and we are done. Yeah, so now we don't have any squiggles. So the markup should be ready and it will be using the same CSS classes because I've just changed CSS class to class, but I've kept all those things. So now this should be ported. And to finish the default view model, we need to do just a couple of things. So let's look at the code behind. And now what we are doing. So in the pre-render, I'm loading categories and I'm loading tasks. So we can copy this out and we can override pre-render. So let's do this. And the isPostBack is hidden in context. So it's just a small change. And then we can copy out the load categories and load tasks. So let's do this. But right now we are not working in the controls in the UI. The biggest difference of MVVM approach is that you are not referencing components in the page by ID. Instead, you are just manipulating with these properties and the controls respond to them thanks to the data binding. Yeah? So you won't be writing text box 1.text equals something. You will just manipulate with the controls using the view model properties. So basically what I need to say is the tasks equal, oh sorry, I have accidentally tried to run the project. That wasn't what I wanted to do. So I can create a new task service and get tasks. But as I said, I would want to use the dependency injection from the first moment. So what I can do is to build a constructor here and request a task service and I can also request a category service. And as I was showing yesterday, it's a great thing to have them defined as a field in my view model because they wouldn't be serialized into the JSON and sent to the client, which is exactly what I want. Okay, so load tasks, it's easy. And I won't be creating new task service. I will just use the one I had injected. And the same applies with the categories. We can just say categories equals category service dot get categories. That's it. Also, in the yesterday's session about MVVM, I explained that if the category list doesn't change ever in this page, we can use the bind server to client first request, so it won't be posted to the server and back on postbacks. So this is an optimization to save some network traffic, and loading task, it will just work, it will just fill the collection and the repeater will display all the items. And what's missing? Just adding the tasks. So let's go back here to the WebForms markup and let's copy paste this. And it will be also much simpler than before because I don't need to read the state from my UI controls. I already have the task name and task category IDs properties in my view model. So I can remove this and I can just call task service at task, and I have new task name property in the view model, and I have new task category IDs in my view model. Yeah, and it's a list of integers, exactly the same thing which my business layer works with. Yeah, so this is really great. Now I want to reset the form, so I can say new task name is string empty, new task category ID is clear, because on list there is the clear method, and I'm loading the task, which is a method I have already implemented. And now I'm finished and I have been able to rewrite this page. Okay, so let's build it. Hopefully, I don't know how I did it, but there are no compile errors. So let's do the final thing. Once I think that I'm ready for this page, I can enable it in the routing. And in order to be tested that both versions are working right now, so I can register it as a test. So when I enter the test URL in the browser, so let's refresh this. Okay, I need to sign in. So admin, password. And when I click on login, okay, this is still the WebForms page. You can see all those nice view state. I love it. And now when and it still works because I haven't really touched it. Yeah, so it works. And when I go to /test, I have the same looking page. The first request to .vvm is here, and it looks almost the same. It doesn't look the same. Let's see why. It should be just different hierarchy of the elements. So this is the original, and the tags are here at the end of this at this line. Here the tags are on the separate line, and let's see why. Okay, there is the diff element, which is probably causing this issue. Yeah, so these items are enclosed with the diff, which is generated by the repeater. And on this page, when you look in the inspect tool, there is just the text and the span elements. So let's fix this. It shouldn't be very difficult. So let's go here, and this repeater is rendering a diff element around the items. So let's tell him render wrapper tag equals false. And when I refresh this page, and when you just change the markup, you don't need to recompile the entire application. So I have just, okay, if I am rendering wrapper tag, I cannot use the ID attribute. So let's remove it because I still don't need it. I don't need control IDs much in .vvm. And now the page looks same. There are different paddings in the checkboxes because this was using table. This is not using table. They are just in the same line. But it's responsive because this line can wrap. So you can just add a tiny piece of CSS to make it look exactly the same pixel perfect. And now when I am trying to add a new task, so I can check some categories and click on add task, and you can see that the page works exactly the same as before. Yeah. And once you say, okay, this old page, I really don't need you, then you can just go to the routing and use the same URL for the new page. So let's do this. And now we are reloading. We changed the C#, so now the application needs to be recompiled and run again. And now I'm on the default URL. And if you view the page source, you can see there is no view state. We are now running in .vvm. Yeah, so this is .vvm. Okay. Final thing, what about authentication? When I sign out, I'm going to the login page, but it's strange. I shouldn't, because I haven't restricted this for my default page, but maybe WebForms sees their own route to default ASPX, and therefore they redirect me to the login page. However, if you want to secure this page, you should use authorize attribute, because once I would remove the default page, I would lose this rule. So now I'm using the authorize attribute from .vvm framework runtime filters. And if you are not signed in, then in such case, this would handle all the authentication. So it integrates quite well with the authentication model. So now when I sign in, I will go to the default page, hopefully. Yeah, and it will work. And the authorize attribute won't kick me off, because I still have the user identity. Yeah, the current request identity is the user is still signed up. So .vvm will allow this user. Yeah. If I wouldn't have the user identity, then .vvm would redirect to the login page exactly the same way as WebForms are doing it. Yeah. So this is the authentication. Once you get rid of all WebForms parts, you will need to change the authentication, but it shouldn't be so difficult, because in .vvm the authorize attribute is the same on ASP.NET Classic and ASP.NET Core. Yeah, so in the view models, the only thing you will need to change is this, and if you place this into some separate file, it will be even easier to change later. So maybe signing out is different. Okay. So if you are wondering whether you should rewrite your application from scratch or if you want to modernize it, so it's a very difficult decision, and I'm not trying to say it's easy, because there are a lot of parameters and a lot of criteria you need to include into this decision. And it's not only about the technology, it's also about the future requirements for the application. If you plan to do fundamental changes, then it would be probably the rewrite. If you just want to incrementally improve it, then the modernization might be more feasible. It also depends on the team member skill set. If you decide that you rewrite the application to some other technology, it means that all the people in the team will need to learn these things. Learning .vvm, of course, it's also learning a new technology, but .vvm is conceptually similar to WebForms, so you wouldn't fight with so many different things. Yes, there will be differences, but there will be much less differences than with, for example, Angular or React. Also, it can be about budget, because when somebody in the management hears rewrite, they are thinking, okay, it will cost millions of dollars. We don't have that. Okay, so you need to modernize it. But it really depends. Maybe fundamental changes in the application can justify the investments, because now the application can earn or save much less money than the current version. So it's also a business decision. And of course, you should support new devices and new platforms. So if you are maybe thinking about progressive web apps, this can also affect the technology choice you may do. So it's not an easy decision, and probably there is not even a single person who can decide if you should modernize or rewrite. But if you decide for modernization, .vvm can help you. It's not 100%, it's not streamlined in that way that you would click next, next, finish in some wizard, but it's possible. And as you could see, porting a page, it's not a matter of hours, it's a matter of a few minutes during this session.